Hello, how are you? Today I want to again get back to one of the fundamental underpinnings of all this law of attraction, law of assumption, manifesting stuff, and talk about it really from a sober psychological level. Because I think we really need to discuss so many of these manifesting ideas from that level. And what I see is a lot of people getting confused because they instead are using very spiritual, grandiose language to describe concepts that essentially, at least for most of us, we are going to be applying and integrating into our life in a very pragmatic, psychological way. A lot of this stuff is not the deep spiritual endeavor or discovering your I am or whatever you want to call it that most YouTube content creators seem to make it out to be when it comes to improving our lives and feeling better. I welcome that viewpoint if people want to share it. But at the same time, I think that viewpoint is really overshared and incorrect. And we've spoken about this so much, but I think a big problem is people primarily share this very spiritual I am viewpoint about this law of assumption, law of attraction material. And, they talk a big game. It sounds great on paper. It sounds great in theory. Some people have incredible success stories with it. I'm not denying those success stories exist. They absolutely do. But people make it sound very simple and easy. And that like the theory all fits in place, that everything that Neville Goddard says or that Abraham Hicks says is just gospel and absolutely true. And the reality is that's absolutely fucking wrong. All the great teachers are interpreting these ideas in their own way and explaining it in their own way. And to be frank, far too many of them were dogmatic. And as I said in the video the other day, my most recent video, we're all full of shit. We're all full of shit. But what we see a lot in the LOA space is people taking ideas so dogmatically, taking the theory so dogmatically and becoming really full of shit and claiming you can do all these, fantastical things, which again, I don't always deny that you can sometimes do them, but making it seem like we should all easily be able to do them consistently. And I see very few people who can consistently demonstrate or manifest significant changes in their life over and over and over again. And if they can, the way they explain it is usually very differently than the kind of dogmatic style that's so popular on YouTube. So that was my initial spiel to get you into the spirit of this video, where I'm going to read from somebody who talks about these ideas more soberly and more effectively and got the results consistently for people when others, I think, failed to do that. And that person, unsurprisingly, if you know my channel, is Emil Coue. I'm going to be reading from his masterpiece, Self-Mastery Through Conscious Auto-Suggestion, which in my opinion is the best book of the last 150 years or so when it comes to these LOA ideas. But yeah, this is, in my opinion, what's usually going on. It's not the spiritual angle, okay? People use this spiritual angle a lot of the time to get you to believe. You use big spiritual terms like I am, and it gets people to believe. I'm going to be putting out a podcast episode within the next week, quoting from somebody who really explains I am well, the concept of I am, an Indian mystic by the name of Nisargadatta Maharaj. There's a famous book of his teachings called I Am That. And if you get into Nisargadatta Maharaj and, contemplate how he's talking about I am and what I am is and what I am is not, you might come to the same realization that I have and many others have, which is this LOA stuff has almost nothing to do with the I am in all big capital letters. It's about pragmatically improving my life. And that is a spiritual, practice in and of itself, obviously, but it's much more pragmatic and psychological than most, I would say, of these, people on YouTube making videos and commenting want to admit. They will find out eventually. And unfortunately, a lot of them will find out the hard way that the spiritual stuff that seems so grandiose doesn't work the way that they hoped for consistently as they thought. And, they will realize gradually, a lot of these folks, if they still get into if they're still into this stuff, a lot of them will quit because they'll become disillusioned because it won't work consistently for them because they don't really understand what they're doing. But those who don't quit will realize that, my gosh, I've been spiritually bypassing and neglecting just the more common sense element of this stuff and making it this grandiose, dogmatic spiritual pursuit that I should not have done. If they stay with this stuff long enough, a lot of the time that's what will happen. But we can skip all that by just going right to the straight up psychology. This is what Emil Coue said. Emil Coue, who helped, helped literally tens of thousands of people cure themselves each year in the 19 teens and in early 1920s. And by the way, before I forget, I'm offering a 6-week kind of like intensive with me, coaching intensive, where you get to speak with me once a week and exchange emails with me throughout 6 weeks at a very reasonable price. If you're interested in going deep and doing some real inner work on this subject, the way we're talking about in this video, you can contact me at radicalcounselor.com. Anyway, this is what Coue said. And in my opinion, you've probably heard this quote before if you're familiar with my channel, because I've read it before. In my opinion, this is most of this LOA stuff. And this is why most of this LOA stuff does not work as well as people say it's going to work. Because it's harder to do this for most of us than people say. And even Coue, as great as he was, and he was the best in my opinion, he said it was easier than it actually was for many people to do consistently. Nonetheless, he's the best. So let's read this. Coue says, and mind you, Coue, this is when Coue wrote this when Neville was still a kid, or maybe in his early 20s. This is way before Neville. Neville got stuff from Coue, okay? This is most of the law of assumption without the spiritual language. He said, we must therefore endeavor to direct our imagination, which at present directs us. In this way, we easily become, physically and mentally, masters of ourselves. How are we to arrive at this result? By the practice of conscious autosuggestion, which is based on this principle. Every idea firmly implanted in our minds tends to become true for us and to realize itself. Thus, if we desire something physical or mental, we can obtain it sooner or later, provided we repeat rapidly and often that the thing is going to happen or is not going to happen, according as to whether it is something desirable or undesirable. I'm not saying that's all of the law of assumption, guys. I'm not saying that's all of the law of attraction. But it's most of it. The difficult part for most of us is implanting the idea. Because standard affirmations and even stuff like robotic affirmations, as powerful a tool as that can be, often is not enough to convince us, to convince our minds. But Coue says, and I agree, and I think most people into this stuff would agree, if we can convince ourselves that something is going to happen, if we can firmly implant it in our minds, it tends to become true for us and to realize itself. That's the work. That's everything. That's why you hear all about these cool techniques. Again, I'll put a link above. Neville said near the end of his career, all my techniques, all the stuff I do, it's all figurative. It's all figurative. It doesn't have any power in of itself. Nothing. Sats, living in the end. Everyone is you pushed out. That's all figurative language to get you to believe, to implant the idea. Because if the mind accepts the idea, if imaginatively you accept the idea, it tends to become true for us and to realize itself in our external reality. Okay? The difficult part, the part that takes work, is doing that. That is not manifest something in 3 days and, that's it. I'm not saying you can't manifest something in 3 days, but doing it consistently, you have to do work to get to that point. I know all about the sensationalist stuff. I believe some of the sensationalist stuff for sure. But you got to show me the proof if you can do that stuff consistently. You can't just spout theory and expect me to believe it. And too many of you watching YouTube videos and on Reddit and into this stuff just believe people blindly when they can't prove shit. It's not what this is about. This stuff is hard, or more people would do it. You think robotic affirmations, for instance, are something new? It's the easiest thing in the world to do in terms of theory, just to say something over and over again. You think people haven't been doing that for, millennia? Let's not put our heads in the sand when it comes to this stuff. This stuff is, generally speaking, difficult to integrate because, as Coue said, our imagination tends to be like a wild horse. And at first, for most of us, it's like, how the hell could I ever domesticate this horse and ride it? But, what Coue and these other great teachers like Neville are saying is you can do it. You can learn to guide your imagination. Again, if we desire something physical or mental, we can obtain it sooner or later, provided we repeat rapidly and often that the thing is going to happen or is not going to happen, according as to whether it's something desirable or undesirable. Now, this repetition is what our imagination, what our thinking is actually doing. Okay? You can't fake it. It's what actually is going through our mind. The reason that robotic affirmations work very well some of the time is because if you say something enough, you start to believe it. So if you have something looped over and over and over again, and it starts to loop automatically, and it starts to be implanted that something's going to happen or not happen, and you feel it like that's the case, so it automatically just, it becomes a belief, essentially. In all likelihood, it will become true for us in some significant way. Here's the thing. This is something else people don't like to hear that needs to be talked about. If I can find the page. Coue basically said that when we are practicing this stuff and it doesn't work, that it's our fault. Just like Neville said, and a lot of these great teachers, we have to take kind of a radical responsibility to work with our imagination. And that is very sobering, because we're going to fail a lot when we're working with our imagination. And our lives are going to change if we're working with our imagination. And again, this is the stuff people don't want to discuss, but this is the truth. Coue said, if formerly you have been in the habit of making unconsciously to yourself bad autosuggestions, now knowing what I have taught you, you must not let these bad unconscious autosuggestions occur again. And if in spite of all I have said and done, you still persist in making them, then you have only yourself to blame, and had better strike your breast and say, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. Sorry, I don't know if I pronounced the Latin right, but, that means my fault, my grievous fault, my fault working with my imagination, not someone else's fault out there in the 3D, my fault. This is why the other day I was talking about walking up the hill and getting really angry with myself and swearing and cursing to directly address my state and what was going on, because I knew that my imagination was running riot against me, right? And I knew it was my fault. I created that. imaginatively. You know? It's like Joseph Murphy's got that great saying, and I'll paraphrase it here. I made a podcast episode about it before regarding fear. He says something like, when a baby's born, their only fear is of heights and water or something like that, because they don't want to die, right? They don't want to fall or get dropped in water or whatever. He said all of your other fears. This is again a paraphrase. Joseph Murphy said all your other fears are imaginary. Get rid of them. Get rid of them. And when we start soberly working on ourselves to get rid of our fears, to get rid of our shame, to get rid of the sadness we feel, we realize this is real grown-up work. Ain't no joke. It's not manifest something in 3 days, 3 weeks, get your SP back in 2 weeks or whatever. It's the real deal. It's lifelong work, and it's gratifying. But we have to do it. We have to do it if we want to see practical results, right? And if we don't do it, that's fine too. But knowing about these ideas a lot of the time in regards to how we feel, if we feel overwhelmed and basically unable to do something and feel like we're overpowered and helpless. And quite honestly, I think most of us feel that way some of the time. I certainly did the other day. We have to take radical responsibility that at least emotionally on the inside, it's our responsibility to do something about it. And then in all likelihood to take appropriate outer action as well that corresponds to a change of our state to that which we desire. Again, Coue said, if formerly you have been in the habit of making unconsciously to yourself, and mind you, Coue said that unconscious and imaginative are synonymous for practical purposes. So if you formerly have been in the habit of making imaginatively to yourself bad suggestions, now knowing what I've taught you, you must not let these bad imaginative suggestions occur again. And if in spite of all I've said, you still do it and persist in making them, then you've got only yourself to blame, and it better get honest with yourself. Strike your breast and say, my fault, my fault. My grievous fault. This is the real shit, man. Isn't this fun? This is what it's about. If we're doing serious inner work in regards to these LOA principles, in my opinion. So yeah, if you're interested in that 6-week program or have any questions for me or would like to find out about some of the books I've written, I can be reached and information can be found at radicalcounselor.com. Until next time, take radical responsibility and be happy.